By 10:23 in the morning on June 4, 1942, every man in that formation of American dive bombers knew, almost beyond any doubt, that he was about to die. Not might die, would die. They were hundreds of miles from home, dangerously low on fuel already, about to dive on the Japanese carrier fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, with no fighter escort and no realistic hope of rescue if anything went wrong on the way back. Nobody said it out loud. Nobody turned around. One of the pilots in that formation would go on to do something no other pilot, American or Japanese, managed during the entire war. Put a bomb directly on 3 different enemy warships, on 3 separate days, and watch all 3 of them sink. His name was Norman Jack Kleiss. Everyone who knew him called him Dusty. Everything that follows comes from his own memoir, Never Call Me a Hero, written with historians Timothy and Laura Orr and published in 2017, plus U.S. Navy historical records, contemporary accounts, and cross-checked service history, where a detail comes only from his own recollection rather than an official record. I'll say so. Kleiss was born March 7, 1916, in Coffeyville, Kansas, the youngest of 3 children. By his own account, he was independent to the point of being a handful almost from birth. At 4 years old, he apparently decided he simply didn't like the name Norman and started introducing himself as Jack instead, using only his middle name, and stuck with it for the rest of his life. He grew up during the Depression in a strict Methodist household, and by his own later telling, childhood in 1920s Kansas involved a level of unsupervised risk that would be almost unthinkable today. Kids playing in ways that, as he put it himself, meant you either lived or you didn't. At 12, his mother was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and the family split apart for a time, while his father took her to Baltimore for treatment at Johns Hopkins. For Kleiss and his siblings went to live with an uncle, a surgeon, and young Jack spent that year fascinated watching him work. For a while, medicine looked like the path his life was going to take. His mother died the following year, when he was 13. What actually redirected him toward the military was a training exercise with the Kansas National Guard, which he joined as a teenager. During a field exercise on horseback, an umpire ruled his entire cavalry unit dead, explaining that a single enemy biplane flying overhead would, in real combat, have simply strafed every man and horse in the formation with machine guns. That was, by his own account, the moment it became obvious to him that the future of warfare belonged in the air, not on horseback. He set his sights on the Naval Academy at Annapolis from there. He didn't get in on his first attempt. He landed only an alternate slot the year he applied. So in the meantime, he enrolled at the University of Kansas on a scholarship, still hoping a spot at Annapolis would eventually open up. A year later, one did, and Kleiss shipped off to begin 4 years of training that would turn him into a naval officer. As a midshipman, he was sent out to the fleet for hands-on training aboard the USS Arkansas, where he was put in charge of one of the ship's gun turrets and had to get his crew qualified as expert gunners. He graduated the Naval Academy in 1938 and, after a stretch on other ships including the cruiser Vincennes, applied for flight training. After 11 months at Naval Air Station Pensacola, without a single training crash to his name, he earned his wings on April 27, 1941, and was assigned to Scouting Squadron 6, VS-6, flying the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber off the USS Enterprise. Dive bombing itself was, at the time, a genuinely new and brutal discipline, pioneered only a few years earlier, that amounted to pointing your aircraft nearly straight down at an enemy ship covered in anti-aircraft guns, holding that dive through everything they threw at you, releasing a bomb at the last possible moment, and then hauling out of the dive hard enough to black yourself out under the G-force, hoping the enemy didn't finish you off on the way back up. Unlike fighter pilots, there was no such thing as a dive bomber ace for public recognition, no matter how many direct hits a man scored. It was, by design, some of the most dangerous and least glamorous flying in the entire Navy. It's during this early training period that Kleiss's lifelong friendship with a sailor named Bruno Guido began. New pilots practicing carrier landings normally flew solo, with sandbags standing in for a gunner's weight in the back seat. There was no reason to risk a second man's life, while a rookie proved he could land safely. When Kleiss climbed in for his very first attempt, he found Guido already sitting in the gunner's seat instead of sandbags. Kleiss tried to talk him out of it. Guido just looked at him and said, "You got wings, don't you?" Guido rode along for all 6 of Kleiss's qualifying landings. It became the start of a real friendship between the two men. By late 1941, with America edging closer to war, the Navy wanted propaganda footage of its new dive bombers in action for recruiting films and war bond drives, including a staged sequence simulating a plane getting shot down and trailing smoke. Ground crews rigged acid canisters onto one aircraft, set to release and vaporize into a smoke-like trail on command. During the actual filming run on September 1, 1941, the pilot carrying the rigged canisters released the acid too early, while Kleiss was still flying in tight formation on his wing. The acid drifted directly into Kleiss's cockpit, fogging his windshield, cracking his goggles, and burning his face and hands while he was still airborne. Momentarily blind, he leveled off completely by feel, only realizing afterward, when he finally got a clear look outside, that he'd been flying just 50 feet above the ocean the entire time, close enough to have died without ever knowing it. He landed the plane and spent the next 9 days in the hospital recovering from the burns. By late November 1941, Kleiss and the Enterprise were at sea, escorting Marines to reinforce Wake Island, under orders that felt, to everyone aboard, unusually serious for a peacetime patrol, including standing instructions to sink any Japanese submarine on sight. Bad weather delayed their return to Pearl Harbor, pushing their arrival back by 2 full days. It was that delay that put the Enterprise roughly 200 miles out from Pearl Harbor, rather than safely in port, on the morning of December 7, 1941. Kleiss wasn't among the 18 planes the Enterprise sent ahead that morning on a routine scouting flight toward Oahu. He'd been flying for 2 straight days already, and was held in reserve. Those 18 planes flew directly into the Japanese attack force, headed for Pearl Harbor. 5 of them were shot down before anyone on the Enterprise understood what was actually happening. Confused, broken radio transmissions started coming through the ship's tower, voices insisting they were being fired on with live ammunition in what should have been peacetime skies. By the time the Enterprise raised her battle flag and the loudspeakers announced war with Japan, Kleiss was already in the air, part of a hastily scrambled patrol defending the task force itself. 2 months later, on February 1, 1942, the Enterprise led the first American carrier offensive of the entire war, striking Japanese-held islands in the Marshalls, Kwajalein, Woche, and Tarawa in the Maluilap Atoll. Kleiss took part in the raid, dropping his bombs on ground targets and strafing installations under heavy anti-aircraft fire, and later diverted to hit a Japanese cruiser at anchor that his own account credits with sustaining serious damage, even though post-war Japanese records showed the ship ultimately survived the war after extensive repairs. It was Kleiss's first real taste of combat, and by every account he came through it without a scratch, a pattern that, unnervingly, would repeat itself again and again over the following months. Late February brought a strike on Wake Island itself, the American outpost the Japanese had captured in the war's opening days. Kleiss put his main bomb into a Japanese ammunition depot, triggering a massive secondary explosion, then went hunting for any remaining target and found only a small enemy patrol boat working the coastline. According to his own telling and his gunner's corroborating account, he strafed that boat run after run until he'd emptied his machine gun ammunition entirely, leaving it burning and drifting, abandoned by its own crew. Early March took the Enterprise's air group to Marcus Island, deep enough into Japanese-controlled waters that few American aircraft had ever operated there before. Kleiss dove on an enemy barracks through heavy anti-aircraft fire. One of his bombs released cleanly and struck the target, while a second stuck briefly under his wing before he managed to shake it loose safely out over open water on the way back. By the time the Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor to resupply and take on replacement pilots, Kleiss had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions in these early strikes. Then came Midway. To understand what Kleiss actually did on June 4th, 1942, you have to understand the trap both sides had set for each other. Japan's Naval Command had concluded that American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the only three the U.S. Navy had left in the Pacific, had to be destroyed before Japan could secure the region for good. Their plan was to stage a real attack on Midway Atoll as bait, luring the American carriers into the open where four Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, could overwhelm and sink them. A diversionary strike on the Aleutian Islands was meant to split American attention and forces even further. There was exactly one flaw in the plan. American codebreakers had already cracked enough of Japan's naval cipher to know almost precisely when, where, and how the attack was coming. All three American carriers were waiting near Midway before the Japanese fleet ever arrived, hidden and ready to strike the moment Japan's own carriers were vulnerable. Decks crowded with returning aircraft, refueling and rearming. Kleiss and the rest of Scouting 6 were woken at 3 in the morning on the day of the battle. Breakfast was steak and eggs, a meal, by long military superstition, usually served right before something terrible. In the mission briefing, the dive bombers learned they'd be going in without any fighter escort at all, launching from roughly 175 miles out, far enough that, factoring in the attack run and a deliberate course change afterward, meant to throw off Japanese observers, there was a real chance of running out of fuel entirely before making it back. If that happened to one plane, it was likely to happen to all of them at once, since every aircraft in the strike was flying on roughly the same fuel margin. Rescue, that far out, was close to a fantasy. The strike group's overall commander that day, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, was actually a fighter pilot by training, placed in charge of the dive bomber formation by seniority rather than specialty. Flying toward the target at a fighter's cruising speed rather than a dive bomber's more fuel-efficient pace, the formation burned through gas faster than planned, and when they reached the coordinates where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be, there was nothing there. McCluskey organized a box search, burning still more fuel, until the formation spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing at full speed. A ship that, unknown to the Americans at the time, was rushing to rejoin the main fleet after chasing off an American submarine earlier that morning. McCluskey gambled that the destroyer was heading back toward the carriers, and followed it. 3 minutes later, the Japanese fleet came into view. By the time the Americans located their target, Kleiss's fuel gauge read below half a tank. Every pilot in that formation understood, without anyone needing to say it, that they were now almost certainly not making it back to the Enterprise regardless of what happened next. They attacked anyway. At 10:23 a.m., McCluskey gave the order to attack, without, in the confusion, clearly assigning which squadron would strike which carrier. Most of the formation ended up diving on the Kaga. Only Lieutenant Dick Best and his two wingmen peeled off in time to attack the Akagi separately. McCluskey's own group missed the Kaga entirely with their bombs. Next in the dive was Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, whom Kleiss considered the best dive bomber in the squadron. His bomb struck home, tearing through a parked Japanese fighter and exploding on the hangar deck below, while his incendiary bombs ignited fuel and aircraft already spotted on deck for takeoff. Kleiss went in right behind him. He held his dive down to 1,000 feet before releasing, lower than the standard release altitude, putting his 500-pound bomb and both wing bombs into the forward section of Kaga's flight deck, close to the ship's painted Rising Sun insignia. Within 5 minutes, American dive bombers from multiple squadrons had mortally wounded 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers present. Kleiss and his gunner, John Snowden, pulled out through a wall of anti-aircraft fire and geysers of water thrown up by near misses, fought off pursuing Japanese fighters, and turned for home. Looking back from a distance, Kleiss watched flames finally reach the Kaga's ammunition stores. The resulting secondary explosion threw the ship's forward elevator into the air and left nothing recognizable behind once the smoke cleared. He made it back to the Enterprise with less than 3 gallons of fuel remaining in the tank. The fighting wasn't finished. That afternoon, with 3 Japanese carriers destroyed, American forces went after the 4th, the Hiryu, in a strike led by Earl Gallagher. Kleiss led the second flight in, again diving toward the ship's flight deck, again releasing at 1,000 feet, and again scoring a direct hit, one of only 4 or 5 pilots in the entire attack to actually connect. The Hiryu, like the 3 carriers before it, was left burning and eventually had to be scuttled by her own escorts. The following day, June 5th, Kleiss flew again, this time in a fruitless attack on a lone Japanese destroyer, the Tanikaze, that came away from the encounter undamaged. On June 6th, American forces caught up with the remnants of the retreating Japanese fleet, the heavy cruiser Mikuma among them, already crippled from an earlier collision during the chaos of retreat. Diving through what was left of the ship's anti-aircraft defenses, Kleiss's bombs struck near the cruiser's smokestack. It was his 3rd direct hit on his 3rd separate enemy warship in 3 days of fighting, a feat no other pilot, on either side of the battle, matched during the entire engagement. All 3 ships he hit went to the bottom of the Pacific. For his actions at Midway, Kleiss was awarded the Navy Cross that November, the U.S. Navy's 2nd highest decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. Not every friend from that period came home. Bruno Guido, the same sailor who'd once told Kleiss, "You got wings, don't ya?" and ridden along on his first 6 carrier landings, was flying as a gunner for a different pilot, Frank O'Flaherty, during the Midway strikes. Their aircraft, damaged and leaking fuel after a dogfight with Japanese Zeros on the return leg, ran dry and had to ditch at sea. Japanese sailors recovered both men from the water, and, in one of the war's harder-to-stomach footnotes, Guido and O'Flaherty were interrogated, tortured for information, and ultimately executed by being thrown overboard, weighted down, days after their capture. Kleiss would carry that loss for the rest of his life. With Midway won, the Navy pulled its most experienced dive bomber pilots out of combat rotation entirely, rather than risk losing them to attrition, the theory being that veterans like Kleiss were more valuable, teaching the next generation of pilots than continuing to fly missions themselves. Kleiss requested 30 days of leave, then married his longtime girlfriend, Eunice Marie Moshon, known to everyone as John, at a wedding chapel in Las Vegas, less than a month after the battle that had nearly killed him 3 separate times. He spent the rest of the war as a flight instructor, first at Naval Air Station Norfolk, later at Cecil Field in Florida, taking the responsibility seriously enough that he pushed back hard, more than once, against pressure from higher command, to pass along students he genuinely believed weren't ready to fly combat missions. In October 1943, he left instructor duty for the Naval Postgraduate School, moving into a career path focused on procurement and technical development, helping the Navy evaluate new aircraft, weapons, and carrier equipment for the remainder of a Navy career that stretched to 24 years in total. Kleiss retired from the Navy in 1962 with the rank of captain, and only then did he go back to using the name Jack full-time, setting aside the Dusty nickname a Midway-era ground crew chief had hung on him after a runway mishap early in his training. He worked afterward for Lockheed before eventually settling with Gene in San Antonio, Texas. For decades, Kleiss said almost nothing publicly about what he'd actually done at Midway. He reportedly never even told his own father he'd taken part in the battle, let alone that he'd played one of its single most decisive individual roles. He didn't think he deserved special credit for surviving what so many friends, Bruno Guido among them, hadn't. It wasn't until he was 99 years old, the last known surviving dive bomber pilot from the entire battle, that Kleiss finally sat down with historians Timothy and Laura Orr to record his account in full, feeling, by his own explanation, that it had become his responsibility to preserve the story before it was lost for good, not for his own sake, but for the men who hadn't made it home to tell it themselves. He titled the book, simply and firmly, Never Call Me a Hero. Norman Jack Dusty Kleiss died on April 22, 2016, in San Antonio, at 100 years old. His memoir was published the following year, timed to the 75th anniversary of the battle he never wanted credit for winning. He's buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. 3 enemy warships, sunk by his own hand, over 3 days in June of 1942, and for the rest of his long life, he never once let anyone call him a hero for it.